So today we're going to be doing a little bit of a react video. We've done quite a few reactions to Christopher Hitchens things. We have also done reactions to Sam Harris. And so I just wanted to kind of round out the four horsemen and do one on Daniel Dennett, as well as later doing one on Richard Dawkins. And while I'm abundantly familiar with Richard Dawkins as well as Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris to some extent, I know very little about Daniel Dennett. This is one of the more popular videos that is on YouTube, or one of the first ones that pops up when I search him. It is Daniel Dennett, What is Free Will? My understanding, while I've looked at his work briefly before, I have zero recollection. My understanding is he's kind of in the realm of philosophy / neuroscience, and a little bit more on the neuroscience kind of front, and he is going to be answering what is free will. I don't know what his answer is, but this is something that I have a little bit of expertise in, as I do have a degree in philosophy, and this is kind of something that we take a look at, and so I will be giving my opinion, as well as we will be watching Daniel Dennett's, so let's jump right into it.
Dan, if I were to believe in materialism, physicalism, that everything in my mind is my brain, and everything is determined in a physical world, how then can I have free will?
I think this is...
So this is the very central question, and my kind of how I look at it is I think that there's a bit of a bait and switch when people talk about free will. There is this absolute type of materialism that people like to invoke, where it's well, your parents caused your genes, and your environment caused your upbringing, and those two aren't within your control, and since those are driving you, this is kind of Sam Harris's argument, then this means you're not really the author of your actions. But I think that there's kind of a bait and switch that gets used when talking about this colloquial understanding of control over our own actions, where when we're evaluating free will, we use this kind of absolutist 100% control, and then we're referring to both our parents and our upbringing. And then when we talk about day-to-day who's responsible or what the causes of things are, we use a much more we use a much less rigorous understanding of cause and who did what and free will and this sort of thing, and that there's a conceptual bait and switch that's maybe not appropriate. But let's see what Daniel Dennett says.
This is the hidden agenda for all of the consciousness work, and particularly the controversy around it. People want to know about free will. They want to protect free will, and so they should. It's very important. But what they also have to realize is that free will is just as hard to reconcile with indeterminism. If the world is undetermined, it's just as hard to see how you could have free will that mattered, because you want to determine what you do. It's really interesting that we...
So this is a little bit of an interesting turn. My guess is maybe his background's not in philosophy if he's talking about it in this way. That... it's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek to say we want to determine stuff, because this is not a type of way that you would talk about determinism, this sort of a way of saying, well, if we have free will and we aren't determining things, then there's not an especially large meaning. So I guess we just have to listen on and hear exactly what he means by this.
Use this word determined. And mainly, it's a term of praise. We say, she's so determined, and so we should. We want to determine our actions.
Yeah.
This philosophically is not what determinism means, but I'm guessing he's going on a different track.
We don't want us to be determined in the determining of our actions. Now, I think that people have been looking in the wrong place for 2,000 years and more on this. They've been looking at physics. Determinism, indeterminism, physics.
This is generally kind of the way the more analytic philosophers kind of look at things, where they say, hey, you're a collection of atoms. These atoms have certain forces acting on them. These certain forces will have these other results, and because these other results can, be predicted if you had a sufficiently powerful machine, you're not really the cause of your actions, because, fate or whatever is determined. It's moving in a singular trajectory, and so generally speaking, it's more analytically oriented. When you're talking about philosophy, the more analytic type philosophers will trend towards determinism, and the more continental ones tend to try and reconcile free will in some way.
They should have been looking at biology, because
the
key to free will is understanding that Free will is a biological level phenomenon. It's not a physical level phenomenon. We are freer than...
On some level, like, eventually biology gets reduced to physics, but this is not my purview. But it's interesting that he splits it, or, well...
Our parts. Our parts don't have free will.
Okay.
But we do. Now, how could that possibly be?
Without adding something extra.
Without adding anything mysterious. So we have to make free will compatible with determinism.
Right.
But we're not going to say that our actions aren't determined, but we're going to show that they're not inevitable.
Okay, so this is an important distinction, and he uses the word compatible, which I haven't read up on my compatibilism recently, and so this is a little bit of an interesting one. Let's just keep watching.
Now, the most natural thing in the world to say is, if my future is determined, then it's inevitable. What on earth does that mean? Compare. If my future is determined, it's determined. That's true. That's just a tautology. So what does the word inevitable add?
A lot of philosophy arguments kind of get reduced down to, disagreements about the meanings of words.
What does it mean more than determined? If we want to get clear on this, we have to see what inevitable
Seeking clarity in this way and parsing through the words is an important thing to do.
means. It means unavoidable. So then we have to get clear about what avoiding is. And then we can begin to see the biological dimension.
See, one thing about when talking about your actions being caused or being determined or being unavoidable, one of the problems is there's no such there's no time machine. No one has a time machine, and so this is not a falsifiable thesis. Very often, people who are in favor of determinism, people like Sam Harris, will say stuff like it could not have been otherwise. And while this might be true, it is not a falsifiable thesis, meaning you cannot demonstrate it to be false because you can never go back in time and see how it could have, and prove that it could not have been different. Just run the simulation 100,000 times, right? And if it's exactly the same every single time, then you know it could not have, well, you don't know it could not have been different, but you have sufficiently ample evidence that is reasonable to believe. But this is not possible because you can't wind back time. And so, to some degree, to talk about something being inevitable is, anytime someone does this, they are relying on something other than like a sort of, it's not a falsifiable thesis, which is generally what you want to look for when you're thinking scientifically. You want to look for arguments that can be proven false, and then by trying to prove them false and failing, you demonstrate, the strength of the argument or the theory.
Because what's happened on this planet over the last 4 billion years has been an explosion of avoiding dissolution, avoiding being eaten, avoiding starving to death. What evolution has done is designed organisms that do a little bit of avoiding. And
I'm starting to think that he might be a biologist in terms of his background. I can't remember, but this would make sense, especially why he's alongside Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist in terms of background.
It's been an arms race, and the avoiders have become cleverer and cleverer and cleverer. And how do you avoid something? You avoid something by anticipating it and then taking corrective measures.
Right.
Simplest case, incoming brick. You see it, you duck, you avoid it.
Okay.
You say, well, you see, I avoided that incoming brick. Well, was it ever really going to hit you? No, because the light bounced off the brick into your eyes. You saw it in time so that you ducked. So suppose you were determined to duck.
This is an excellent metaphor for thinking about free will, because it's, if you didn't intervene, the brick would have hit you. And there is, I think that this kind of, to some degree, highlights one of, like, the bait and switches when people are thinking about determined, because they use, like, this sort of absolutist way of thinking when justifying their theory, and then they take the justified theory and then they apply it, to something else that's not anywhere near as theoretical. And so, for example, like, let's say I'm determined, or all my actions are determined, and they're determined by a combination of my biology, which is caused by my parents, and my environment, and this sort of thing. And so when I take this highlighter and I throw it, did that go through? Okay. When I take the highlighter and I throw it, when you ask what caused that, it could not be me and my action if you believe in determinism, and instead what would be causing it is the combination of, my environment and my parents, right? But then we go back to my parents, and they're not really responsible for me throwing that marker either, because they're determined by their biology and their environment, and so you have to go back to their parents, etc., etc., and eventually you have what's known as an infinite regress, where you're kind of just pointing back towards previous causes down the chain when you were talking about responsibility. And the question, or the simple way of putting this is, if I take this highlighter and I throw it and I ask the question, who is responsible or what's responsible for that highlighter being thrown, the context of this question is not an absolutist one, it's a colloquial one. And in this question, any answer other than I'm responsible for throwing that is a bit absurd. And what the determinist wants to use is they want to take this rigorous type of logic where it's like it's parents and environment, and this sort of thing would lead you to an absurd sort of position where when asking who caused the, well, I don't want to throw my nice pen, who caused the throwing of they want to say that it was caused, by the environment and the people. But what you get is it goes back infinitely, and to the eventual point where who threw the toothpicks, it's entirely unsatisfactory to answer that with something preceding the Big Bang, I know not what, which is what you get with the analytic sort of interpretation, and it can't be applied colloquially. And this is what I mean when I say that I think that there's often a conceptual bait and switch, because generally when we're talking about free will, why is this important? What's the takeaway? Is talking about morality and personal responsibility for behavior. And so, they want to say that in this theoretical sense, we have no control over our actions, they're determined, and then take this colloquial sense and then say it doesn't, because we theoretically know that free will doesn't exist, it doesn't apply in this colloquial sort of free will understanding, but the context has changed. It's grossly inappropriate if I knock a folder off of a table. It's grossly inappropriate when someone asks, why are the papers on the floor, for someone to say something preceding the Big Bang, I know not what. That's not a satisfactory answer. The answer is Peter did it, right? But this is, it belies kind of like this, there's this dual track bait and switch. Let's get back to Dennett.
Well, then the brick was never going to hit you, was it? It just seemed as if it was going to hit you. What we have to understand is that free will is our capacity to see probable futures that seem like they're gonna happen, in time to take steps so that something else happens instead. Now people say,
let's rewind that.
Futures that to see is that free will is our capacity to see probable futures that seem like they're gonna happen, in time to take steps so that something else happens instead.
This is a very different definition than what is commonly used in the philosophical discipline. And I actually kind of like this definition. So let's just, one more time. I apologize.
Probable futures are capacity. What we have to understand is that free will is our capacity to see probable futures that seem like they're gonna happen, in time to take steps so that something else happens instead.
So in this, framing free will as a capacity, generally when it gets covered philosophically speaking, it is covered in such a way where you're talking about responsibility and cause. What caused this? What caused that? And with that, you have an infinite regress of causes, right? As kind of discussed with the example. But with this, he's talking about a capacity, which is not it's quite a bit different, that we could have seen something coming, anticipated it, and done otherwise. I'm not entirely sure. I think this is a satisfactory definition, but it is definitely a lot different. And with this sort of definition, the free will obviously seems like a thing that is abundantly available for a lot of different organisms and humans, and also it's much more compatible when we're examining that sort of definition theoretically and kind of in practical contexts, but it is very much different than like trying to think, who is the cause of this thing? Am I the cause of my own actions? And could I have acted otherwise? This sort of definition does not address these sorts of questions, which is perhaps a good thing, but it's not very in line with academic philosophy regarding free will.
Now, people say you can't change the past. That's true.
Yeah.
You can't change the future either. From what to what? I mean, the future is what happens next. But what you can do is change what you thought the future was going to be into something else. And then
some might split hairs with the notion that you can change something if you are already on a determined path to not change it, but this is
the key to avoiding.
Here's my problem. I see at the physics level this absolute determinism of particle and particle from way back. Now,
this is the kind of philosophical general, what is popular in philosophy, from what I've seen.
The biological level, we're talking about avoidance. So how does the avoidance help us to avoid the determinism? Because it is determined.
Well, it is determined, but just remember that that's not as important as people have thought, because it doesn't apply inevitability.
I hate to tell you
determinism. So he's of the position that it is determined, but it is not inevitable, and this means that we have free will. He's using words definitely a little bit different than what is normally done in, from what I have seen, like in the philosophical discipline. And so it's a bit difficult to unpack without, clarifying with Dennett what exactly he means by some of these things.
Conclusion I seem to be coming to, I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I seem to feel, if it's all physical, that free will, there's something wrong with that definition, or
exactly.
I can't deal with a traditional definition of free will under either scenario, determinism or indeterminism, unless I add something extra and some non-physical stuff. Then I can get my free will.
I think that's right. I think we have to recognize that, sure, there are varieties of free will, the traditional varieties, which, who cares whether we've got them? The varieties that matter, the varieties of free will worth wanting, as I've said, are perfectly compatible with determinism. Now, do we have to give
the types of free will that we want, which is, I guess, the ability to avoid a future you anticipate under Dennett's understanding of free will? So this is just redefining free will, where it's no longer concerned with cause, which is interesting. And then he wants this type of free will. I don't know if this makes him I don't know compatibilist theories as well as I should, in order to really unpack this from a philosophical perspective. I still think he's coming from biology, but let's continue.
Give up something? Yeah, we have to give up some of the ideology about freedom. We also have to give up something, and good riddance to it, about blame and responsibility.
That was scarce.
He wants to give up blame and responsibility, and this is generally why free will is considered to matter philosophically, is because if you are not morally culpable for your behavior, then it is not reasonable to hold you or if you're not truly the cause of your behavior, it's not reasonable to hold you morally culpable. And this is kind of Sam Harris's position, where there really shouldn't be any sort of punishment that does not act as a deterrent, because it is tantamount to torture. And he believes in punishment that is a deterrent, but outside of deterring, there's no reason for punishment. Whereas if someone has free will, under kind of the normal definition, then punishment makes sense, because they could have done something otherwise, they chose not to, and so it's appropriate to punish them. If they cannot do otherwise, then it would not necessarily be appropriate to punish.
Some people.
I think so. They want to be absolutist about responsibility.
They want to be absolutist. This is exactly the problem where, again, when we were talking about kind of having this definition that is deeply theoretical and flawless and categorical and everything is either yes or no, responsible or not, this sort of theoretical, and then they want to take this sort of context and then apply it to like a much more colloquial thing, like who's responsible for throwing the highlighter, and it's not something preceding the Big Bang, I know not what. That's not a satisfactory answer. The answer is I'm responsible for throwing the highlighters, in my opinion. But like, I also don't really want to broach whether or not, in terms of my position philosophically, I don't want to commit to not being a determinist, because I understand the argument. But it's like, it's a contextual type of argument where contextually in certain, like, if you're talking as abstract and theoretical as possible, I like the determinism argument, but it doesn't necessarily apply, or you can't necessarily extrapolate all the other things, like from there's no free will type of arguments, because the context, I think, is different.
I mean, the idea. So they want to be absolutist about responsibility. Yeah. I mean, the idea of just in the eyes of God, sin, that has to go. But what we replace it with is still a very rich and familiar concept. And that is, we're not deluded about our sense of our own capacity. We are determined to be the masters of our fate to a surprisingly gratifying degree.
We are determined to be the masters of our... See, I don't like the way he uses determined there, because it's different than the way that people who are pro or who are anti-free will use it. But there's one part he said at the end that I thought was significant.
We are determined to be...
This isn't it.
Our sense of our own...
It's the sense of the own
capacity.
capacity.
We're not deluded about our sense of our own capacity.
We are not deluded about the sense of our own capacity. This, I think, is, I think that this is an interesting kind of focal point, or point to emphasize, is that, I think if you take the determinist type of argument at face value, it seems that we suddenly have no control, which is, in my opinion, mischaracterizing the situation, even though in the, like, deeply theoretical sense, we don't have any control over anything, and we're not responsible for, like, there's a breakdown of control, right? But we're not operating always in this deeply theoretical space. And so, that, our intuitions about our ability to control things are not wholly and entirely inappropriate. Now, they may be to some degree illusory, but, one of the contexts you're in, as much of consciousness may be like illusory or a brain construct or like this sort of thing. But even if something's illusory, then this just changes the context a little bit, because you are operating within an illusion then, and this is the soup you're swimming in, and this sort of thing. Now, this is probably way too abstract to like really try and unpack, but this was a little bit of an interesting kind of introduction to Dennett. And my guess is he's a bit more of a biology background. I don't know. I did not research him beforehand, before doing this, which may have been a bit of an interesting thing, so I wasn't knowing what to accept. I think that he uses the word determined in a way that is not necessarily... unless I'm misunderstanding what he's saying when we are determined, because if he's trying to say that things are going to unfold in a particular way, and he's trying to say determined without inevitable, meaning there's, I don't know exactly what he means by this. Like, there's force being applied, but that it could have been otherwise, or this sort of stuff, or that we are changing something through this like avoidance principle that he introduces, something like this. I suppose I would need to see him like kind of answer questions or do like a further sort of thing, but I think that's beyond the scope of this video. I hope this was a little bit interesting. It was interesting for me to unpack a little bit as well as talk about free will. I know that I've talked quite a bit more than we've actually seen Dennett talking, which is maybe not appropriate for a Reacts video, but here it is. If you liked, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm stuff, and other than that, have a good one.